Good afternoon. I would like to call this meeting to order. It's not really a meeting, I guess. This is a special special meeting. It's a board workshop with regards to our upcoming budget. So may we have a roll call, please?
Director Potter? Here. Director Riley? Here. Director Burns? Here. Director Evans?
Here.
Director Adams? Here. Director Hopkins and Edwards have not come.
Okay. If you'll please join me, we'll have the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Thank you. I'd like to open us up for oral communications. Anybody wishing to address the board on anything that is not on our agenda today? Okay, seeing none, we'll bring it back. We have one discussion item to review and discuss the proposed FY 19 to 20 district budget and resolution 2019-06. I will turn it over to
I'm going to
Dave.
start, and just what you have in front of you, by the way, is for Monday night's closed session. So if you could fill one of those out and return to Arlene before the meeting's out. So as you know, budget's based primarily on people and projects. And so I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the people part before Suresh walks us through the whole budget presentation. What we'll be asking for within this budget is authorization but not filling 3 positions. But let me tell you how we got there. So 3 years ago, this was the organizational structure. We had 4 divisions, but we had water supply in one division and groundwater engaging data in another division. We had river habitat in one division and river fisheries in the other division. And what we had happened since that time, the community liaison's position was already vacant, but we've now since outsourced that. We had a retirement. We had GIS leave. We had another retirement in HR. We had office specialist leave. We had a retirement on the river. We had a retirement in project management, the water distribution system area. And that led to a subsequent redistribution of that work to the water demand division. We had conservation representative 1 leave. We had a retirement in conservation. We had another retirement on the river. And then we had our accountant leave. And most recently, Larry Hampson retired. So all of these changes, have created opportunities to remake some positions, change job descriptions, move work around. But we didn't quite get all the way there. So where we are currently is 3 divisions with the fisheries pod, as I like to call them, kind of not reporting to a division, but to me directly. Water supply, groundwater, engaging all got into one place, but we still had the river habitat and the fisheries in 2 different places. We outsourced GIS and we outsourced human resources. So where we propose to go is going back to 4 divisions, filling the division manager slots that Joe Oliver retired from and Larry Hampson retired from with internal candidates, which we'll be talking about at the board meeting Monday night. All of water would be within one division called the Water Resources Division, and all of the river and other environmental activities would be in a newly named Environmental Resources Division. There are some new positions that are in this budget. That's an assistant fisheries biologist, primarily created for a monitoring program, basically a physical weir on the river to do fish counting for steelhead. An office specialist, accounting and office specialist. This person may pick up some of the contract work that we're looking for. And I'm sorry, I've got this, the accounting office specialist is the position we already have. That little circle should be up on accounting contract specialist. And what we've determined, what you'll see in the staff note, is that the accounting contract specialist may be left open because we might be able to get some of that work onto the accounting office specialist. So sorry about the oval being in the wrong place. But these three positions are included in Suresh's budget with funding, and then the proposed reorganization will be subject to the agenda on Monday, which is, as I said, going back to 4 divisions, but moving things that are alike into the same area. So it combines related job functions. It aligns with our internal financial structure. As you recall, we have a mitigation section, a conservation section, and a water supply section. So it would be much more aligned with that. It will authorize but not fill the potential needs. So all of these positions are basically do not fill for 6 months, come back to the board with the job description, ask for permission to go out and search. So you would have another bite at the apple. But as I said, they're reflected in the budget you're about to look at. So that's it on the people side, and then Suresh will walk us through the entire budget.
So, Madam Chair, I just had a question about the organizational chart, and I realize in a perfect world it would be nice if we didn't exist, but where is the board of directors in the organization?
You're up in the cloud above everything.
Yeah, I realize that, but we don't seem to be, it just seems to be this dictatorship with the general manager. And we don't seem to be on the org chart anywhere, so I just was thinking
Yeah,
it might be nice if there was some acknowledgement of our.
I think the one that's
authority.
officially posted on the web acknowledges and also has him reporting directly to you as well. But, all right, I'll have you know, it's more vertical than horizontal. It wouldn't really fit on the page, so.
So then continuing on to the general manager's dictatorship. Just for everyone's reference, the staff note that's in the budget packet, it's on page 1 and 2. The resolution on page 3 and 4. The actual budget document, the detailed packet, starts on page 5 and goes all the way to pages 48. So this would be the normal annual budget process. Typically, we address this at the regular board meeting. This year, we're doing it in a special board meeting, budget workshop.
Suresh, you need to use the microphone.
So we developed the annual budget, and this is in line with what was adopted by the MPWMD board in January of 2004. And the strategy was an 8-part strategy. 3 of those are on here. It was to develop every year an annual balanced budget, to maintain all of the services, existing services in place, enable the district to carry out its mission and vision. Also, the general operating reserve at that time was pretty low. We were using the reserve balances frequently every year. So the goal was to move the reserve balance from 5% to 50% over the next 5 years. So it was from 2004 to 2009. Happy to report the budget I'm presenting here tonight that has a reserve balance of 88%. So we've definitely met that goal.
And if I could just intrude on this. So in 2004, where they said balanced budgets, they had already for approximately 3 or 4 years at that point in time had been balancing the budget with reserves and continued that practice all the way to 2011 before Suresh and I got here. And we had a decade-long analysis, which is due to the primary reason that reserves got so low in that period. So for those of you who were here at that time, you may remember we finished the year of 2011-12 at less than 300,000, I think, in reserves.
It was actually $30,000 in our LAIF account at that point.
Yeah.
And today we have about close to $10 million in our LAIF account. And we will show you all the contingencies we do have. There's some obligations there too. So even though it's a high reserve number that we have in place, but there are also some outstanding obligations that we will be addressing that as part of my presentation. So the 1920 budget, we were mindful of the current status of all our funding sources. We do have three major revenue sources: the property taxes, water supply charge, and also the user fee paid by the CalAm ratepayers. The original budget was distributed by the divisions itself, and then they were reviewed by and made adjustments in the team management setting. We did have a one-day session of team management. We were able to balance it all throughout that one session. The format of the budget is same as what was presented in previous year. We didn't make any major changes. And then the restructuring changes that Dave had talked about, all of those are funded in this budget, even though, as Dave had mentioned, we will get those approved but not funded at this point, but they are placed in the budget itself. So just what Dave had mentioned, despite staff's effort in the past, the 2004 strategy to develop the balanced budget, we had been using some reserves. And over the last few years, it was primarily due to the PWM project, the Pure Water Monterey project. If you recall, we were doing some heavy spending on those projects. So last few years, we had to use for those. The 1920 budget, we are using reserves. We could not balance the budget without using the reserves. So, and I'll take you into the expenditures, and you'll see there are some hefty expenditures outlined in this budget year. And then, as I had mentioned before, the total reserve balance with this budget sits at 88% of the operating budget. The total budget for 1920 stands at $17.7 million. It is higher than the 18-19 budget. And then the full year of user fee revenues are included in the proposed budget. And again, the user fee is one of those. It's not a stable revenue source because it's tied to the water sales. So water sales do go up and down. And so what we do is we routinely monitor that and make adjustments throughout the year. And if there are any adjustments, we will bring it to you in the mid-year budget adjustment in February. But we always kind of like keep track of that pretty close just because it fluctuates quite a bit. So some of the large budget expenditures that's included in this budget, the completion of the ASR Phase 1 expansion site, that's going to be a little shy of $3 million. The operations ASR Phase 1 and Phase 2, 447 and 37, those two are reimbursable items by CalAm ratepayers. The potential Pure Water Monterey expansion project at $800,000, the board did approve that project several months ago. So if that moves forward, we will have to spend about $800,000 on that, and that actually is part of the $1 million project cost, but the district shares 75% of that cost. The operating reserve, Pure Water Monterey, goes online. As a result, we will have to bank 1,000 acre-feet of water in the ground, and that would be called the drought reserve or operating reserve. And because we are banking that 1,000 acre-feet of water in the ground, somebody has to pay for that water, and so the district has to pay for that water, and the price tag on that is about $2,000 an acre-foot, so for 1,000 acre-foot, it's $2 million. So on this page, as you can see, there are some heavy project-related items on here, and those, the top one and the last two almost counts to about $5.8, $5.9 million worth of project cost. Getting into the projects again, Los Padres Dam Plan, $322,000. We have local water projects, $100,000, $106,000 is slated for the city of Seaside. Another $96,000, $94,000 is a placeholder for any other projects for any other jurisdiction that may come along. CalAm D-Cell project, that's the financing work, $250,000. Monterey Water System feasibility study, that's the $650,000 project. $250,000 is planned on spending in fiscal year 18-19, the remainder $400,000 in 19-20. And then the geochemical model update, $110,000.
And on the CalAm D-Cell project, that's the financing, the securitization, or the ratepayer relief bonds. We will know probably by July whether they've received approval for state revolving fund funding for all of the non-shareholder finance costs, which would mean that we wouldn't need to proceed with the public financing. So it could go away.
Fish Rearing Facility, they have a $490,000 expenditure in the project line. riparian, other erosion control projects, 133,000. Hydrologic monitoring program, that has a price tag of 118,000. And then the Ford removal at Hastings Reservation, $100,000. Want to speak?
Yeah, purely a placeholder. That's the one that we talked about, where we would only participate if they come up with other funding sources, and we're still waiting for a proposal. So it may or may not materialize, but it's in the talking stage.
Conservation-related activities, 344,000. Then we have the rebate program for conservation, 700,000, and that's reimbursed by Calum ratepayers. And then the completion of the design and construction of the Sleepy Hollow facility, 270,000. And that number's gonna get changed by the time we go to the final version of the budget. But it will not have an impact to the budget itself because it's the carryover from last fiscal year into next fiscal year. And that's that $2 million project that will get completed in August-September timeframe. So the project cost, comparing over 1920 to 1819, it's about 19% increase from last fiscal year. The personal cost stands at $4 million, a little over $4 million, and that's about a 5% increase from prior fiscal year, and that's with all the reshuffling of the new positions in there. So it's not a big jump.
Suresh, is this budget to actual or budget to budget?
This is budget to budget. Service and supplies, 2% over prior fiscal year. And then legal services, we continuing to keep it at the same level. We're kind of like keeping an eye on those for the last 5 or 6 years, and we feel that $400,000 number is a good number. Contingency, we have 70,000 as same with last fiscal year. Debt service for Robber Bank loan, that's again same as last fiscal year, 230,000. We continue to pay on that loan, and the balloon payment's not gonna be due until 2023. The fixed asset purchase, there's a reduction of 63% over last fiscal year, 213,000. The main reason for the huge reduction there is because the Acela database was being completed in the fiscal year 18-19. So we're gonna do the completion of the project this fiscal year. It's not gonna be a continuation. And then the capital equipment reserve, 49,000. General reserve, we're gonna put aside 402,000, and then the pension reserve, if the board recalls, we started the creation of the pension and OPEB reserve last fiscal year, 18-19, and we had set aside 100,000 each for last fiscal year. We also are planning on setting aside 100,000 each for the pension and OPEB reserve, so that would bring our reserve balance on those two line items at $200,000, so we're setting aside 100,000 there. And your board recalls that we took an action last month to do the reclamation project, $1 million project financing over 2 years, and that's that $1 million that's also slated in the budget. So looking at the fixed asset purchase that I was talking about, 213,000, this is what makes up the 213,000. We've got some computer upgrades in there. We've got the AV system upgrade that's in the room where basically all the videotaping and everything happens. We still have a backup generator in the budget that will continue from last fiscal year, and a vehicle purchase for the WIA program, 25,000, that's from last fiscal year. So all of those shaded items, they are a carry forward from last fiscal year. We are just rolling them over into this fiscal year. And then there's also a replacement vehicle at $40,000. That's basically going to be a SUV hybrid type vehicle that we haven't identified yet, but we are a vehicle short, and so we will need a vehicle. Looking at the expenditure summary itself, the $17.7 million, you'll see about 48% of the budget is consumed by the project expenditures. About 1.6, little under 1.6 is consumed by the reimbursement projects. There's that $1 million reclamation project. Personal cost, you'll see $4 million, which is about 23% of the budget. And then service and supplies, 8% of the budget. And then fixed assets, 1%, reserves at 4%, and then the debt service at 1%, and contingency less than 1%. Shouldn't say 0, should say less than 1. Now, changing focus and looking at the revenues itself for the district, we are estimating budgeting $5 million on the user fee revenue. This is slightly higher than the 2018-19 number, but lower than the 17-18 number. And the reason why it's a little higher than the 18-19 number is because we feel June is gonna be a high use month because of the US Open activities going on in town, so we've kinda like based it on that. Water supply charge, $3.4 million, that's the same as last fiscal year. And we are continuing to collect about the same, close to 3.4. Property tax is a little higher than last fiscal year, a little over $2 million, and that's based on our last 2 years of actual collections. We've looked at it, and so the property tax for this fiscal is about 3% higher than last fiscal year, and we feel that's gonna materialize. It's a good number. Capacity fee, that's just like a planning number. We don't know how many people are going to pull the permits and pay the capacity fee, but looking at the trend for the last few years, $400,000 seemed a good number for a budget. Same thing with the permit fee, basically just a budget. Don't know how many people are going to pull the permits, but again, looking at the prior fiscal years, last 2 years, we feel that $230,000 number is a good number. Interest is $180,000. That's based on all of our accumulated reserves sitting in the LAIF account, our money market account, and also our CD accounts. And then other revenues like legal fees and a couple of other fees that kind of like people walk into the counter and pay. Those are all slated for $15,000. So all in all, our total district revenue is going to be $11.2 million. And if you recall on the previous slide, the expenditure shows $17 million. So the district revenue is only 11, and I'll show you how that kind of like adds up. The reimbursement revenues from CalAm, $1.2 million. That's including the ASR operations. It includes the rebates. The grant of $213,000. We have some minor other reimbursements from the projects like the Water Master account, the reclamation project, that stands at $126,000. Oh, I'm sorry. The Water Master and the reclamation are two separate line items. So that's the other reimbursements, which stands at $126. But then the next line is the Water Master at $35,000, reclamation at $20,000. And then the legal reimbursements and the recording fee at 16 and 6. So the reimbursement revenue brings in about 1.6. So the district revenues, which is about 5% over prior fiscal year, 11.2, which I went in detail. The reimbursements, which are about 58% lower than last fiscal year, 1.6. The carry forward from prior fiscal year, the $2.3 million number, this is the number that basically we had budgeted for projects in 2018-19, but we did not complete the projects. So those project monies are just carried forward into this fiscal year, 19-20, so that's the $2.3 million. We are setting aside, actually, we are using $28,000 from the capital equipment reserve. And so the fund balance, this is where I said this is not going to be a year where we cannot use our reserves. This is where basically we are pulling in $2.5 million from our reserve to balance that $17.7 million budget. So now if you look at the revenue number at 17.7, this matches up with the expense number 17.7. So this is the 2.5 is what basically fills the gap. Looking at the revenue summary, 28% comes from our user fee, about 19% comes from our water supply. Property tax makes up about 12% of the budget. The carry forward number, about 13% of the revenue budget. We are pulling in $2.5 million from our fund balance, which is 14% of the budget. The reimbursements about 8%, and then capacity fee, permit fee, those are all 2%, and then grants and interest at a percentage. So that's how it makes up the $17.7 million on the revenue side. Looking at the sources and uses, the expenditures in the revenue side, $17.1 million. The $651,000 setting aside on the reserve. So this is gets a little confusing here, so I'll try and explain it, and then there's a few more slides where I'll try and explain it even more. What happens is that we accumulate all our cost based on cost centers, so mitigation, conservation, water supply, and we balance the budgets based on those individual funds. So for example, mitigation, we account for all the revenues coming in for the mitigation program side, and then we account for all the expenditures going out of the mitigation program side. Like, for example, all the river work are done, captured under the mitigation program. Conservation works are captured under conservation program, under conservation cost center. And then any water supply related activities are captured in the water supply cost center. So we balance each of those funds out. Well, this year what happens, because there's a lot of water supply related projects, about $5 million worth of projects, which are purely water supply related. That project was out of balance, but then the mitigation and conservation fund did have surplus money. So that's what that reserve, the $650,000 is. It accounts for conservation and mitigation program side of it. But then on the water supply side, we needed additional funds to balance that fund. So we kind of like have to net it out. Money going in, money going out, and I'll show you in the next slide how that kind of like is balanced out. It may be a little confusing on this slide. The district revenues 11.2, reimbursements was 1.6, and then the carry forward, and then the reserves total combined of $4.8 million coming out, so that's what balances the budget. Showing a 5-year revenue summary. This is basically just showing how our revenue has been over the last 5 years. Keep in mind the 18-19 is just a budget number, but prior to that, all the other years are actual numbers. So really, it's very stable in terms of looking at the water supply charge, the blue bar at the very bottom, that's 3.4. Then the property tax, which was right around about 1.8 to about $2 million, so that's fairly stable as well. The first 2 years had the purple bar in there, which was the mitigation revenue. The board recalls when we did not have the user fee, we were under contract with CalAm to get the mitigation program revenues. So that's what was coming in, but once the user fee got implemented, the purple bar mitigation revenue did go away, and then the green bar took in effect, which is the user fee. So you can see the user fee, how unstable it is. I mean, from year to year, we basically can't point a finger on it and just say that that's exactly how much we're gonna get each year. We try and do a good budget, keep track of it, but that's the only unstable part of it, and it all drives based on the CalAm water sales. Looking at the 5-year district expenditure side of it, again, very stable. You'll see the very bottom bar, which is the blue one, is the salaries, is right in line over the last 5 years. Benefits and taxes, somewhat very similar. Then the operating expenditures, really not much of a big jump. The blue, or the light blue bar, which is the professional fees, and then the orange bar, which is the capital outlay. That changes slightly, varies. But then the project expenditures, which is the green bar, you can see that kind of like varies year to year. I mean, depending on the needs for the district, what project needs to be done, that's what drives that number. Looking at the reserve itself, the very first column there which says 2019 budgeted, and then a column 2019 estimated. So what I'm showing here is basically what we had in the budget itself, which was at the end of the day, June 30th, 2019, we showed we were gonna have $13.9 million. Now, based on our latest observations as to how much projects are not going to be materialized, are going to be carried forward into next fiscal year, we are estimating our reserves to be at $18.3 million. But then, when we do conclude our next fiscal year budget, 19-20, the reserve's going to stand at $14.1 million. And the reason being is, as I had shown on the previous slide, most of the projects that was not carried forward, it's going to get continued into next fiscal year. So that kind of like drives the number that's made up of that $18.3 million. So if you see right above 18.3, the operating reserve jumps from $12 million to $16 million, but then jumps down to $12 million, because when we conclude the year, we are putting the unused funds into our reserve balance, and then when we start the new fiscal year, we basically are drawing from that reserve balance again. So the two numbers to compare would be the 2019 budgeted number of 13.9, and where we're gonna end our 2020 proposed budget number, which is gonna be 14.1. So that's a slight increase of what our reserve was budgeted for 2019. And the footnote there, operating reserve ending balance projected to be 88% of the operating budget. That's the one I said when the board adopted the strategy in 2004. The goal was to get it from 5% to about 50%, and now we stand at 88%. So most of the reserve balances do sit in the general reserve, which is about 88% of the total reserve. We do have the litigation insurance reserve at 2%, 250,000. Capital equipment reserve at 553, flood drought at 2%. And then the debt reserve, this is related to the Rabobank loan. And then the pension reserve and OPEB reserve, you see that says 200,000 because we had budgeted 100,000 for last fiscal year. We are planning on setting aside 100,000 and then planning on setting aside 100,000 for this year as well. So that'll make those two numbers go up to 200,000. So because our reserve number seems to be a little high, one would assume that it's a little higher than what an agency should store or keep. We also want to point the board's attention to the future obligations and commitments that we have. We have the potential Pure Water Monterey expansion project at $2 million. Again, we don't know if it's going to materialize or not, but that number is out there. The water allocation process, about $1.3 million. We have the Rabobank debt that's going to come up for payment in 2023. That's about $3.1 million. We have additional Pure Water Monterey reserve. The $2 million that we are banking aside for the 1,000-acre feet, we have additional, he may know the number.
An additional 750 acre feet in the operating reserve, and then 200 acre feet per year until 1,000 acre feet is set aside for a drought reserve. And so you'd be looking at approximately 950 acre feet potentially in the first follow-up year,
So
and then 200 thereafter.
yeah, total would be 1,750, and so basically 1,750 at $200 an acre foot is $3.5 million. And then we have the pension obligation, which is $5.2 million, and then the OPEB obligation about 4.1. So all in all, our total district's obligations commitments stand at about $19.2 million so far. So that's the reason for showing that slide, that this is the outstanding commitments that the district has that could potentially be used by the reserves that we are accumulating. So that does conclude my presentation.
You should know that there's two items that are potentially going to occur in this fiscal year that we're discussing that are not included. One is any increase in salaries due to cost of living adjustment, still under negotiation. Not a significant number, even at the ranges that are being discussed. And then the second would be any follow-on Measure J related expenses. Because we can't predict the outcome of the feasibility study, we felt that it was inappropriate to include any, but if a feasibility study says go, then we will very likely incur a variety of additional work to be ready for the next phase. So.
Thank you. Thanks, Suresh. Before I come to the board with any questions, I just want to state that I had set this workshop up with the intent that it would go no later than 6 o'clock tonight. I don't know that we're going to go any further, but since there is no action required, it's purely a discussion. I just want to let everybody know that my intent is to be out of here by 6. So does staff does the board have any questions for staff?
Gary, you want to start with this? Go ahead, son. Okay, thank you. How come we won't pay off this Rabobank loan now ahead of time before we go into those issues that you just mentioned? Get that Rabobank loan, why are we waiting to 23 to pay it? And we got money right now, and we could clean that off the board. How come we won't do that right now?
You want to address it?
Well,
Because there's,
somebody address it.
yeah. Well, we've taken the philosophy that we do, well, there's no penalty for just paying what we have to pay, although we do have interest. The interest expense is what per year?
It's about 3.4%.
Yeah. You know, we've just felt like hoarding money was better than paying off debt.
Yeah, and going to a court case, and that's a good idea.
No, that's a real good point. And I think we do need to get our house in order before we head down the path of, if feasibility is indicated and we head down that path. Two things are going to have to happen. One is, before this board would even consider adopting a resolution of necessity, you're going to have an operating plan in place, and you're going to have a series of findings that are almost at the level that you'll want them to be when you actually hit the bench trial. And so that will take time, and it will take some money, but it's not the big exposure of losing at a bench trial, which is a huge exposure. So I think we have enough time to get the house in order for that process. But I think a $3 million liability is a problem if your exposure in losing a bench trial is, as much as Claremont's case, over 10 million. So we definitely need to do all that. I'm just not sure we want to pull the trigger on it right now.
Or pay half of it, three-fourths
Yep.
of it, where it doesn't pains us too much in that. I see money here, and we hoarding it, and we should be paying
Fine.
some of
Yeah.
this big shit down.
It's a trade-off. Yeah. And just for clarity, as Dave Laredo just pointed out, we're also earning on the reserves at the same time. So it may be our negotiable CDs that are kind of staggered out in a laddered fashion. We're actually now hitting interest rates that are approximately the same or even more than our Rabobank loan, or not quite yet.
Little less than, not quite
Little
yet.
less. Yeah,
Okay.
but
My next question is vehicle maintenance. Ever since I've been on this board in the past, we like to buy new vehicles. But we got a vehicle out there painted like a red elephant. How come we don't, any money in here to get that fixed?
We do, actually. We even had money in this fiscal year. I think we were trying to get that addressed, and we're still working on getting it addressed, so it'll definitely get done.
We have money in there to fix it, so off season it could be fixed.
Yes.
Okay,
you mean
thank
painted? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
The
Well,
first,
that's
the
what I'm
first
talking
bid
about,
was,
paint.
The
Over
first
the
bid
top.
was quite high, and then we ended up having to get it rebid, which came out to be a reasonable amount.
Okay. You addressed the pay raises in the future, so that's, and I think I got one more. Vehicles, pay raises, Rabobank. Okay, that's it for me.
Okay, are there any other questions from the board?
I have one.
Okay.
I don't know, were the slides numbered? I can't remember. It was the analysis of reserves. And you had the third- And the analysis of reserves, when it went from 12 million as an operating reserve, and then estimated into this year at 16 million, and then back down to 12 million last year. Was the jump, if 4 million or so, from reimbursable projects? Is there a reimbursable side to this number?
yeah, a little bit. So the Mercer Fraser's gonna, but it's small dollars at this point, isn't it, Larry? It's,
Well, it was going to be if they finished on time, but,
so this is
there's-
the Sleepy Hollow.
The Sleepy Hollow project has a $1.8 million grant, and they were supposed to finish 3 weeks ago, and they didn't. So some of that's getting carried over. So some of that was depressed in the previous years. It'll be increased in this next fiscal year.
Yeah, if you look at the slide that I put up there, you'll see the carry forward from prior fiscal year, $2.3 million. So major portion of that is the carry forward. The projects that were budgeted in 18-19 but did not get carried out. So because when we conclude the fiscal year, if the projects have not been done, any leftover money goes into a general reserve fund and then gets pulled back right out next fiscal year.
But you have two different entries for reimbursements and carry forward.
Uh,
My question was
reimbursements-
the carry forward piece.
Yeah, carry forward piece.
And then the
Okay.
ASR expansion and the new chemical building and so forth. There was a lot of money in the current fiscal year that's being rolled over to next fiscal year as well. So that jump is primarily project-related.
Okay, thank you.
Director Hoffman?
I'm just trying to reconcile between the two documents, the presentation and page 32 of the, at least my page 32 of the packet. The total reserve balance as of 6/30/2019, that's estimated on this document, indicates 18,217,565. And on your presentation, it's 18,388,365. Is there a reason for the difference?
It's probably the one in the budget is the correct version. The one on the PowerPoint is slightly off on the operating reserve side. The 16,855 should actually be 16,684,965.
I'm sorry, could you?
So the number that's showing on page 32 for general operating reserve, it shows the ending balance should be 16,684,965. The number on the slide should show 16,684,965 and not 16,855,765.
Yeah, maybe we're looking at because I'm looking at,
You're looking at 16,855,765?
no, I'm
On the s-
looking at page 32.
Right, so this number right above the yellow, so
Oh,
bottom
yeah, well,
That's the correct
should
number.
have been that, is what he's suggesting, but, yeah, it's $170,800 difference.
in looking at, if we want to look at page 27. Capital assets, replacement, and repair schedule. The schedule does not include any of the assets that the district has as it relates to the ASR, Sleepy Hollow, which has equipment and such, which should be identified, and then a reserve established to account for in the future replacement of those things, yet it does not.
Yeah, the capital equipment reserve was basically generated to fund for fixed asset type infrastructure and not really a capital asset facilities type infrastructure. So the capital equipment reserve that you see that's slated for this chart that you are seeing on page 27, that's purely fixed asset type infrastructure. And none of those capital infrastructure, like the ASR facility or even the Sleepy Hollow facility, both of those facilities are fairly new. And so basically we have not set aside, or we have not started generating any kind of reserves for those facilities. The Sleepy Hollow facility, for example, we have that facility where we spent about $2 million on a grant project. But that facility started with like a 5-year timeline. We didn't know if that was going to be a permanent facility for the agency. And we still don't know if that's going to be a permanent facility for the agency, because once the mitigation program and all that gets taken into account when the desal project comes online, potentially that facility may not get used.
But historically, because the nature of Sleepy Hollow and ASR is, I think in the earlier email we kind of shared this. If we were an operating utility with X miles of pipe in the ground, X number of pumps, X number of meters, so forth, and well rehab requirements, you'd actually fund all of those on a recurring basis, and you do, a tenth of your pipe, or your mains and so forth, and you do 2 to 3 wells a year and so forth, depending on your total inventory. Problem with our 2 major assets, and you can include the building, but we do a pretty good job of putting like the audio-visual stuff or the AC for the building in this equipment list. But the asset stuff, it's also one-off. It's not like predictable. And so, when we start hitting a pump, at Sleepy Hollow, it'll be, that's the next thing that we have to replace. I think we could segregate some monies for that, but we've just treated the general reserve as available for those kinds of things. And then typically, if we know it's coming, or one of the principal staffers who say, hey, at ASR, we're gonna need to do X, then we'll start reserving for it. But you're right, we haven't traditionally reserved because there's no predictable, let's do a tenth of it this year, a tenth of it the next year, and so forth over 10 years. And so it's not been done. But we kind of, as I said, we treat the general reserve as available for that.
Yeah, and let me add to that. So some of those costs at the ASR, like the pump rehab and all that, that all gets classified as operating expense and gets recovered from CalAM ratepayers. So not all of those infrastructure costs there, even though it's like a pump maintenance and stuff that it gets on the district.
But it's, just generally speaking, it's commonplace for reserves, for there to be a reserve study done for those capital assets, and to set aside reserves. I mean, it's common in water utility financial management to do that. So how,
Director Hoffman,
Yeah.
can, if you don't mind, would you put a pin in that and save that for discussion?
well, no, if you don't mind, I think it requires some feedback from staff. So,
Well, we haven't opened up to public comment yet, so it should be questions for staff and then get into discussion.
so if I could just follow up then with a question on this particular thing. So if we're not setting aside under standard water utility practice for reserves, then how are we planning for the replacement and repair in the future of those assets when they reach their end of their useful life?
We have not assigned a specific reserve category for that. I mean, basically, the category you see on here, capital equipment, that's, as I had mentioned, it's purely fixed asset-based capital equipment reserve fund. Definitely, we can create a line item for reserve and call it infrastructure reserve or capital reserve or something instead of calling it capital equipment reserve. But no, we haven't done it to this point. And one of the arguments there would be is that ASR facility is fairly brand new, but following along your lines of discussion, yeah, it definitely is prudent. Maybe we could potentially create a line item to set aside capital reserves.
Well, in fact, it's probably a good idea for replacement wells at ASR. We know we've got sites. We might as well just identify a timeline and start putting money away for future well replacement. We can do that.
I have a question regarding that. You said that if it's under this category, then it wouldn't be reimbursable from the ratepayers. And that was part of the reason that ASR and Sleepy Hollow were handled differently, because some of that reimbursement comes from the ratepayers.
Well, ASR, yeah.
Some of those ASR-related facilities are reimbursed by CalAM ratepayers, but for example, if something was to happen to our building, we'd definitely replace or repair the building at our cost. But if something happens to the pump, definitely that's part of the operating the system, and that is classified as operating expense and gets reimbursed by CalAM ratepayers. We just did a pump rehab on the ASR site about 6 months ago to about a year ago, when we had to pull the pump out and get it repaired, about $70,000 to $100,000 expenditure. It was reimbursed by CalAM ratepayers. So not everything is at the district's expense. There are some things that definitely will fall under district expense as capital.
On the board removal at Hastings Reservation, at our water supply meeting, we had a presentation by somebody from the UC system, who I guess lives there and on site, and indicated that they had, and Larry, correct me or add to this, indicated that they have an interest in that Ford being removed. They're not necessarily interested in funding it at this point, as I understood. But in our discussions at that meeting, it appeared as if, and from input from Larry, as I recall, that any removal of a ford in the Carmel River would require permitting and probably CEQA work. Isn't that, Larry, is that kind of a fair assessment?
Yes.
Yeah, you're gonna need a core permit for getting in the river, and,
Design, environmental analysis.
yep.
Larry?
Yes, it's basically starting from a concept to construction.
And so at this point, we're only at the talking phase with these folks. Is that correct, or am I wrong on that?
Yeah, that is correct.
Well, I think we're talking about partnering with potentially Trout Unlimited or others to help remove that ford.
Right, but I guess what I'm talking about, just for, the reason why I bring this up is from a timing perspective and budgeting it for this year, in that if we're only in the talking stages and there's going to require all the permitting and probably CEQA work, that was brought up at the meeting as well. Is it really reasonable to budget $100,000 for something which, in all likelihood, won't occur in fiscal year 1920?
If a partnership goes forward, you could spend $100,000 on environmental analysis, concept design, CEQA, sure.
And so we would be financing something that is a responsibility of the UC system, because they're the ones who own the property, right? And that they own the ford that's in the river at this point, isn't that right? As far as you know?
But it's not anybody's responsibility currently. It's a good thing to remove the ford.
Sure.
The Water District identified that as a ford to remove, a barrier. It was funded through a grant. And I got to tell you that that grant, which Beverly Cheney helped carry forward, has resulted in, I think, more than $2 million worth of funds coming to the watershed for removal. So if the district were to put forward some funds
No,
to move it.
If you could just back up for a second on your,
Sure.
what you're talking about. You're talking about $2 million for doing what? What? I'm not
Barrier
following.
removal. So Beverly did a study, not just on the main stem, but tributaries, and identified all the fish passage barriers, which included barriers outside of the district's own jurisdiction. Trout Unlimited's now picked that study up. What was it, $65,000 study, $85,000?
In that range, yeah.
In that range. And Trout Unlimited's already gotten grant funding to remove some of the barriers. The idea behind this placeholder is it could happen this year. It might not happen this year. If a partnership is struck, the pre-construction dollars, which Larry was alluding to, can easily be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Being able to enter a partnership is easier if you've got the authorization for up to a certain amount of money. We're not committing you to 100,000. We'd be coming back to you. I think at our meeting, one of you said, I'm not so sure it's worth 100, but it's worth something. Let's talk. But the idea is being able to make a commitment. You can point to, yeah, our board's already authorized this, so now we can partner up. But it might not get expended this year, sure.
I mean, but just from a practical perspective, we're in June already. We're just in the talking phases. Permitting required, probably CEQA work. In your view, is it reasonable to think that there's going to be a need for us, setting aside the fact that whether it's appropriate for us to spend money on fixing something that the UC system is responsible for, that's actually going to be an expenditure that we need to do, in your view?
Well, it's hard to speculate without having,
Yeah,
more
I know.
partners in the room.
Through the chair. If I could, it seems to me this is a discussion either for an agenda item or for board discussion after public comment, because we're not trying to negotiate anything. We're trying to use the budget as a planning document for next year. And so there's some conceptual things that are in here that I think are being proposed. But if anything's going to happen, it's going to have to come back to the full board for some specific action on many of these items. So I'm just questioning whether this line of questioning
No, the
is appropriate at this point. It may be later in this meeting, but not right.
I would
right
Yeah,
now.
the reason why I bring it up is from a budgetary perspective, and that's why I'm bringing it up, is that the appropriateness of putting things in the budget that will not reasonably be expended in the fiscal year which we're considering, and so.
But that, it
That's
may or
discussion.
may not.
Well, that's what
A
I'm trying to
partnership could be
discern.
struck in a month, and then it would be the beginning of our fiscal year, and it would be time to spend some money.
Well, that's what I'm trying to
So-
discern.
Yeah, so in
Right,
April,
and so
April
that is
25th
unable to be determined at this moment, whether the partnership could be struck tomorrow or in 364 days.
yeah,
Nobody
so-
here has any idea.
Yeah, on
So-
April 25th, I went to the, I think it's called Blue Oak Reserve up near Mount Hamilton, and met with UC Berkeley College of Natural Resources people, including people involved in reserve management. And I highlighted this issue, and there seems to be quite a bit of interest. They had heard in a previous meeting about the issue. Then they reiterated they don't have any money to do it, UC. But they are aware of it, and they were very favorable about doing partnerships. So I think to Larry's point, you just don't know, but a partnership could be struck, and the pre-construction monies could be needed ASAP. So it's on the radar screen, but did we know that some of the other capital projects weren't going to get built and get carried over to this year? You don't know. It's a planning tool, but it's not a crystal ball.
Seems like we're getting into discussion.
I agree.
Well, I was just asking questions. And so that's,
Do you have any other questions?
I do.
Okay.
So in the budget, on the local projects number, could you provide additional information or details to what that amount of 200,000 is identified to be expended for?
106,000 for City of Seaside. At our last meeting on consent, you extended their local project grant for the Laguna Grande non-potable supply. 94,000 is sitting there unidentified. We're not sure if we're going to run a solicitation as we've done in the past, or just sit and wait for any of the cities to come with a project. So previously, the last 3 years, we actually solicited, I think we set the budget at 400,000 and then sent out a request for proposals, and PG came back the first year and got 100,000. Pebble Beach came back, and I forget what we did for them with the 2 wells that they sunk at Del Monte and so forth. So we haven't decided if we're going to do a solicitation or just keep that 94 available, waiting for somebody to say, I've got an idea. Most of the ideas have dissipated. There was a lot of excitement the first 2 years, and then just 1 or 2 projects since then.
And on the Calam desal project, there's a line item for $250,000 expenditure. And so my question is, what is that expenditure identified for, and what's the likelihood that it's actually going to be an expenditure that we're going to have during the fiscal year?
Yeah, that's a great question. 80,000 was authorized by the board 2 months ago or 3 months ago, actually January, for investment banking services, and then the remainder is the expectation for the bond counsel firm that we've had all along, that's been on hold due to the delay in the environmental impact report. The bond counsel services would be very expensive because we're at the point of filing an application for a financing order, where basically we would ghostwrite it on behalf of CalAm. They would file it. It's very detailed. It's a 180-day review period, and then the commission would issue a financing order. So all of that would have to happen in this fiscal year, if not for the recommended use policy for the state revolving fund, where the staff recommended that the desal plant be fully funded with state revolving fund monies. And both the investment banker and bond counsel agree that that would be cheaper money, and so we would stop work on the which we've actually done. We put it on hold because the use plan is supposed to be approved or modified on July 18th at the state, I'm sorry, June 18th at the state. And then it would take a little while to get some commitments, firm commitments, that that approval means that there will be money for the project. And so if there is state revolving fund money for the project, then we'll stop work on the ratepayer relief bonds. This project was approved back in 2013, and then because of the delays in the project, just kind of got put on hold.
Now, there was a reference to the fact that even if the state revolving fund provided full funding, that CalAm is, I don't know if it's in some document or in some communication, indicated that regardless of whether full funding would be provided, that they would not accept full funding and they would still want to have a portion of it.
Yeah, approximately 27% from shareholder equity that they would still do, and then state revolving fund would pick up the rest, and then, and the way it was communicated to me, and then any shortfall would be our financing. If that's the case, we likely would not be in a position to make up any shortfall, but because it'd be full funding, they have more than enough money to meet all the costs. So because our work would have to happen earlier to be ready to go, if it looks like our work isn't going to be needed, then we wouldn't commit the funds to actually do it, to pick up the slack, something at the back end, if it's very unlikely that there's going to be any slack. So we'd just cancel out. But yeah, they still intend to do a portion with equity.
Did they provide any rationale for why they wouldn't want cheaper money for that other additional 27%? If this was a discussion that you had with folks there.
That was the question I raised. I said, if you get full funding, does that mean you're not going to do the equity piece? And the answer was, I don't think so. I think we'll still do the equity piece. So.
Director Adams, did you have a question earlier? I'm fine. Okay, I thought you had asked.
The assumption on the $2 million for the operating reserve for ASR, or Pure Water Monterey, excuse me.
Yep.
Based on $2,000 an acre foot. That seems kind of low to me, just in my 35 years of engineering and water recycling, as well as water treatment and wastewater treatment. So I'm thinking that, well, let me ask the question, how did that $2,000 an acre foot number, where did it come from?
Yeah, so when we first received permission to do the project from the PUC, there was a soft cap on the cost of water of $1,720 per acre foot. And that was based on budget at the time. Since then, it's been several months now, but the last time we sat down with Monterey One Water and did a cost of water analysis, there were about, I can't remember how many scenarios were run, roughly 18 different scenarios, but the cost per acre foot was between $1,800 and $1,900 for all but 4 of those scenarios. And so we've been using $1,800 to $1,900 as the internal working number. Pure Water Monterey expansion was closer to about $2,200. The combined would be roughly $2,000, which is what you hear out in the press and elsewhere, if Pure Water Monterey expansion went forward. But without it, we're still at that $1,800 to $1,900. But construction costs will be finalized by September, and we'll know. But yeah, all indications are $1,800 to $1,900.
Wow, that's impressive, actually. You know.
And that's without a Metropolitan Water District subsidy. I think Orange County's cost per acre foot is about $800 to $900, but they're subsidized.
So there's, under budget line item 1-5-1, groundwater replenishment project, there's $800,000 expenditure identified for apparently Pure Water Monterey.
Yeah,
and-
that's the expansion, the $1 million that this board authorized, and our 3/4 of that, so that's $750,000. And then the additional 50 is money to cover items under the Amendment 2 to the cost-sharing agreement, where we said there may be Phase 1 costs that are not covered by the state revolving fund, and that would be things like ribbon cutting or public outreach and things like that that are not allowable by the state. So we put 50,000 in for that as well, because we'll be heading into the ribbon cutting somewhere in October probably.
So we're financing ribbon cutting ceremonies for Pure Water Monterey's project facilities. That's the thought
Yeah.
process here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe I will ask my question. It's off topic, but I'd like to get it.
Is it a question about the budget?
Mhm.
Oh, then it is on topic. Thank you.
So I just wanted to know about the generator.
Yeah.
The backup generator. And what I was really curious about more than anything else is where will it be and what will it serve?
So initially, we had the thought process of putting a generator in the building so that PG&E outage and stuff, we'd have a generator available. We were looking at a place behind the building, but since then, we've had further discussions, and we are talking with the building lighting consultant that actually helped us do the LED retrofits and all that, and they are looking at a combination of solar/power backup, battery backups. And so instead of a generator, it may morph it to that, but we still haven't materialized as to if it's going to be a generator or if it's going to be a combination of solar/battery backup.
And the cost would be virtually similar?
It
About the same.
actually, early indications are that it's going to be much cheaper than what we had budgeted.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you.
And on that topic, at one point, we had talked to Monterey One Water about a shared backup generator, but we've moved away from that to just taking care of our own building.
I have some additional questions, Chair.
Madam Chair, if I might, I'm not intending to stay actually until 6, and I'd rather hear public testimony if we could get to that now. I appreciate, Director Hoffman's concerns about these questions, but it also suggests that it's possible to ask staff these questions in advance of the meeting, and that way, if they're personal questions you'd like asked and answered, you get those done without taking the public's time.
Well, Director
I-
Potter, the whole idea here is that so the public can have the benefit of knowing what the questions are, and so staff can, in the public, provide the responses.
And Mr. Hoffman, this is not my first public hearing, so rest assured, you can certainly let staff know what your questions are, and they could articulate your concerns that you'd express to them before and have the answers pre-prepared. That'd be my suggestion.
So I would suggest we open it to the public.
I'd like to open it up for public comment. Anyone wishing to address any of the concerns on the budget?
Good afternoon. Tom Raleigh. Sorry, I'm still moving at partial speed due to disc problem, but getting treatment at CHOP, so I'm up to about 1/3 speed now. So anyway, speaking as a representative from MPTA, and I'm not going to try and nitpick the numbers because you've got a really good finance officer, one of the most outstanding I've ever seen. But based on my experience in the Navy and looking at some pretty big budgets, I would call this a steaming as before budget, or I could say, here we go again. If you look at the trend over the last couple of years, when you've been up, budget's up around 15 million, and Mr. Stolt recalls, I mentioned before, about a few million here, a few million there. Pretty soon you're talking real money. This budget, if you go back, and I recall, and maybe Director Byrne recalls, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, this is gargantuan in size to what you had then. Now, granted, there's some big projects that the district committed to help, and of course the Pure Water Monterey. But the two major disappointments. One is to see the projection, the double whammy. You've heard me talk about it before. The double whammy for the taxpayers and the ratepayers. The continuation, the water supply charge, and the user fee for the whole budget year through the end of 30 June. And it looks like there's no mention about it disappearing anytime in the future. Or maybe it's in a footnote in your report. Nobody asked about it. This is a big, big item with the people on the peninsula, the working stiffs that are paying the freight, and the high cost of living, which if you go to any city council meeting, at least in Monterey, you're going to hear this over and over. The high cost of housing, the high cost of utilities, and the fact that people have trouble living here anymore. The people that work here, whether they work for the military, DOD, or whether they work in the hospitality industry. This is something I'm surprised, no mention of it. They throw it up, the fees are going to continue the same as before. Very disappointing. Second disappointment is there's no discussion. This is a planning document. You talked about it. I've seen a lot of these over the course of my career, military career. I've seen the city of Monterey budgets for about 30 years. It's a planning tool. But you have to think about it as also a what-if tool. And I don't see anything, I did not say, unless it's a footnote in the document, it wasn't discussed. What if the CDO deadline comes and Cal-Am doesn't have the project started under construction or the permits? September 30th. What if? How will that affect your budget if we suddenly have to be forced to go under rationing? You didn't even talk about it. Anyway, these are the two major disappointments that I see that I don't hear discussed. And if I was a director, I would sure be asking questions on these two issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Raleigh.
Yeah, good afternoon. Rudy Fisher. I want to congratulate the general manager and the finance chief for a really good budget report. I've dealt with budgets for quite a few years, and I think this one was very good. And it's always a learning experience too to look at this, and quite frankly, leave it to Mr. Stolt to come up with. I had never thought about the 1,000 acre feet in the ground as an asset, but you're right. It's something you've paid for, and it's there and it can be used. So it's great. Good learning. Now you made a good comment. Well, first of all, to Mr. Hoffman's question, because I was with Monterey One Water for a while. The initial water is going to be fairly low because 1% revolving fund loan from the state, plus we got about $25 million in grants. So that really helps drive the cost of water down. The expansion, if it happens, I don't think we have a 1% rate. It'll be at a higher amount, and we don't have any grants lined up for that, although we'd be glad to accept some, or they'd be glad to accept some, I'm sure, as they would be glad to accept water district subsidies too. Just a thought. But anyway, appreciate the budget and keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher.
Hi, thank you, John Tilley. Director Edwards earlier had his question around the Rabobank loan and the reserves that are in the user fee column, and those funds were used originally for a water supply project, the Rabobank loan. And the Section 152 committee has voiced, some of them have voiced the idea that the reserves that are there should be used indeed, or at least held in reserve for when the balloon payment does come due. There was a legal opinion granted that those funds could be used for feasibility study, for potentially takeover measures. And that is, in my view, not a water supply project. I would urge you, if you do not, as Director Edwards is saying, pay down the loan now, at least hold those funds in reserve so that when that balloon payment does come due, those funds are available, because if they're not available, where's that money going to come from? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tilley. Anyone else? Okay. We'll close public comment.
Would you like me to address any of those comments? Do you need?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Think about it.
Which particular comment?
Hit them all.
Well, the three of them that we can address. Unless Pinnacle Bank is going to give us a zero interest loan to pay off the Rabobank loan, we recognize that we need to start reserving cash for that because, and that's been part of our discussions. We've talked about quite a bit. So we will be doing that, and it's been raised at the Citizens Oversight Panel, and it is something we know we need to do. To Mr. Rowley's comment about the water supply charge, this board adopted 3 years ago, a policy that said we would collect both charges for 3 years. And it took a year before the user fee was reinstated, so we're just ending year number 2 of the 3-year period. So this was an adopted policy, and it was endorsed by the Citizens Oversight Panel as a reasonable policy because of the variability and the inconclusive nature. And you can already see that the water supply charge, the user fee is not fully predictable yet. And so we will develop a proposal for sunsetting, but it, again, has to be shaded a little bit by after-rising events, and that would be Measure J, and the potential cost impacts of the near-term cost impacts of that if it moves forward. But there is a there is a plan that you've adopted that says collect both for 3 years before developing a sunset plan for one or the other or both. And then the issue about the what-ifs, the reason we don't address the what-if, and this is poorly understood in the community. I did speak with McPoa today, and I've spoken in a variety of different forums. If a milestone is missed, and let's say it happens this year, if next year during that period of time we pump as much off the Carmel River as we did last year, we can weather the loss of 1,000 acre-feet off the effective diversion limit from the river without rationing. If we miss a second milestone, we can weather that. We would be in a negative position if we pump the same as we pumped last year, but we have what's called carryover credit. And I've worked with CalAm, and they've worked with the state to more clearly define what the carryover credit is, and there's a couple thousand, if not 3,000 acre-feet of carryover credit. And so this derives from the fact that we, as a community, have used less and less water. So when the 8,310 diversion limit from the Carmel River was set in the extension of the cease and desist order, that was a 5-year average at about that time. Now we're at about 6,800 and less. And so doing what we did before, we can weather 1,000 acre-feet, and then we can weather a second 1,000 acre-feet by pulling about 450 out of the carryover credit. Can't make it a third 1,000 hit, but we're 2 years out of missed milestones we can handle without budgeting for rationing or what have you.
On that note, please correct me if I'm remembering this wrong, but I thought that the first step on a missed milestone was not rationing. The first step was penalty rates.
Right, and so it becomes, that's precisely correct. And actually the first step, well, we have a 4-step conservation, water shortage contingency plan. We're in the first one all the time, and that's water waste rules. The second step is increased enforcement, public outreach, and voluntary conservation. And then there's a timeline for that to work. And then the third step is penalty rates or conservation rates, which there's 2 stages, that if the first one doesn't get the immediate economic rationing, then the second one goes a little higher. So the only issue with respect to that is how quickly do we want to act, and what are the penalties if we fail? So the goal would be to not put the community in a position where Callan would get penalized and then pass through those penalties. And so we would have to look very carefully at where we're at and whether going step 2, step 3, step 4 would get us quick enough without financial penalties to the community. But you're absolutely right.
Okay, so anyone who states that the immediate reaction to this September's missed milestone, should it occur, would be rationing, that is incorrect.
That is incorrect.
Okay.
And through the chair, could I ask one other question?
Yes.
Isn't it also true that if there's no fault of CalAm, they would not institute the penalty or the 1,000 foot reduction?
Yeah, not quite. So there's a requirement to report in June of the likelihood of meeting the milestone at the end of September. That's the first one. And if there's a high likelihood that you're going to miss it, then you can request a public hearing and go to the state and what you do. the way it's worded is, if the reason for missing the milestone is out of the hands of the company, the mayor's authority, or the district, then we can appeal to the executive director, the state water board, to waive the penalty. But it's that kind of process where we need to appeal rather than it being automatic. And there's
Kinda
always
make the
that,
argument,
yeah, and there's always that human nature piece that says, well, you know, I'm kind of sick of the Monterey Peninsula, we're going to impose it anyway, you know, that, you just never know.
Okay, great, thank you. So, since we closed public comment, we'll bring it back to the board now for discussion. I do have one question before we start discussion. Suresh, in the staff note on page 1, it does say that the proposed expenditures and revenue for this year total 17.7 million, which is slightly more for expenditures. And then on page 11, it says that that is slightly less than last year. So could you just quickly let me know whether that is more or less than last year?
It is more than last fiscal year.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just trying to get to page 11, which was all the transmittal note. Slightly, it is slightly more than.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. General Manager, your organizational chart, is this, I think I'm seeing 3 of them. Is this the final one?
No, this is current. So this is.
No, the current one I know. The new one that you put up there with all the X's and marks and
Yeah.
stuff, is that the final one?
That will be, if you approve that organizational change, that's what will go into this budget, is the proposed organization. So this one is how we are today.
Right.
Budget discussion. The 3 positions that we talked about, new positions, are funded. So we would substitute this chart for that one.
Okay, thank you.
And that's in our agenda for Monday.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Well, actually, all 3 of them are again. And you can decide if you really
I
want
only have one in here.
and you can decide whether you want that presentation again on Monday now that you've already heard it. So.
Thank you. I know you had indicated that there is no salary increase that's listed in the book at all. And at one point I had read, I think you were looking at 3.3% or something like that. Do you know what the figure is
Yeah,
for every 1 percentage
Yeah,
point?
it's 1 percentage point is just under 30,000. It's about 27.5, but rule of thumb 30.
Is that fully loaded?
Yeah.
It's fully loaded.
Fully loaded. Yeah.
And it's, so that was 35-ish, did you say?
No, 30.
30,000.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
That's a good number.
I have a comment on the generator and the potential for solar. I would just hope the district could add as much muscle as it can to every opportunity to do a sustainable infrastructure addition or modification, whatever it is. When we have an opportunity to do that, if we look sustainable first, and even if it's worth, even if it's a premium that maybe we'd have to we have to consider that with margins, but I would hope that we would elevate those to a higher priority than just replacement or whatever the other options might be.
When you adopted the strategic goals for 1 and 3 years, a development of a district sustainability plan, it was one of those goals, because we've been we've been doing it. You know, we've got our 2 electric vehicles and changed out to LEDs and so forth, but there's some issues surrounding paper. There's some issues with our group designations, and when we're chasing disposable utensils and plates and things that have been raised by different directors and so forth. Even trying to get solar panels in the parking area. We don't own the parking area, so we have to get the building owners on board, but absolutely that's the goal. You know, we don't have much of a footprint, so the first time we looked at solar, it wasn't really economic to do so, but running solar to charge battery backup for, you know, we probably have PG&E outages 3 times a year here, and it wreaks havoc on getting work done and so forth. So we will be as sustainable as we can. I think it's ripe for us to lead a little bit, especially if we create an environmental resource division.
Yeah.
Then I think we need to wear that badge a little bit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So with all of the pumps and everything, are there generators attached to those?
John, do you have a generator out at the ASR site?
There, as a backup generator?
Yeah, no,
We only have it at the Sleepy Hollow facility.
right, because you don't want to take a fish. Yeah. So, yeah, so only at Sleepy Hollow, it sounds like.
So I'd just offer a couple observations. One is this is a little bit of an odd budget for me, where I'm used to having the personnel aspect of it be the most heavily weighted item in a budget. And in this case, it's actually 48% of it is in project expenditures, and only 23% is on the personnel side, which is a little odd. So we're obviously a little top-heavy when it comes to project-specific. And when it comes to spending down reserves, and it's just a caveat, it's not, I'm not objecting at the moment, but when we start looking to balance ongoing operations by the expenditure of reserves, it sends a little bit of a caveat that we might be trending in the wrong direction from a revenue standpoint. Those are my observations.
On your first observation, I think that's a very good observation, that just, it's not just an observation, it's kind of.
Well, I think my point is that the project side of it is probably our most discretionary portion of the budget. We
Yeah,
could
and
actually
I do that
tone
same.
back, we could actually, Director Hoffman was asking questions about, the reality of those expenditures occurring this year. Budgeted items and expenditures are two different things. I mean, we budget for things and then we spend the money as needed, if needed. So I think, Gary, your point's correct, that maybe we don't need the monies, but if it's budgeted and the opportunity comes forward to expend those dollars, then it's timely to do that. I support that, but on the other hand, we are quite heavy on the project side.
Yeah, I do a little exercise every year, which is take out the projects and see what it looks like. And because we used to take heat for being just overstaffed and all salaries. And what do these people do? They issue permits, they enter my home, they count my toilets, and it was never very pretty. So when we got into project funding,
Implementation.
it switched. And so we pat ourselves on the back for having such a low component that's staff and salaries, but it'll return as soon as those projects stop.
Yeah.
So
So we're becoming more of a delivery service than we are a permitting agency.
yeah.
Thank you.
Well, and I would comment to that, since the goal of the Water Management District is to provide water, I think we have to be heavy in the project side.
Director Potter, you're spot on to what my observation was, in that we're claiming it's a balanced budget, but in fact, it's balanced based on reserves, filling the gap. And we're lucky that we're flush with funds, but most water utilities don't have the luxury of having reserves to cover the over expenditures with reserves.
Can you go back to the first chart from 2004? Because it is interesting, the goals set forth by a prior board. We've never really had great success. We've never gotten to 50% as a reserve. We've not developed annual budgets in the last 3 years because of Pure Water Monterey. And I guess we do preserve existing services and carry out our legislative mission. But yeah, the financial stuff, it's when you're project heavy, and when our neighbors change it from 50-50 to 75-25, we ended up definitely funding with reserves. But I want to highlight the difference between that kind of balancing of the budget and then what happened in the decade before we got here, which was there was an intentional use of reserves for basic operations, salaries and services, which was probably, as you said, you're heading in the wrong direction at that point. And so it's the same thing but different, if you will.
Yeah, and this year, basically, we did have some heavy projects. For example, the ASR facility, the Pure Water Monterey project, and then the reserve, and all those three are about $6 million on the project side, and we're not going to have that every year. So this is kind of like a one-off shoot a year.
I'm not trying to be critical of the project side of it at all. I'm just trying to be fiscally realistic and saying, we've got this trend going on, and I wouldn't want to see that perpetuate itself. So as these projects come to fruition, then we can get ourselves better back in alignment, and maybe we won't be tapping into reserves. But it's kind of like, just getting one cookie and then you want another one and another one, and it gets easier and easier to do, and so the reserve keeps diminishing. I'm used to budgets where the reserve's like 15 or 20% of your general budget, not something of this magnitude, so we've done well, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I just want to point out also that part of this budget is $1 million, which is a loan. And so it's a repayment that will occur after 2 years, correct?
It's a
The
project
Pebble
investment.
Beach reclamation
Yeah.
project is not a loan, it is a project investment.
Yeah.
But yes, it would return back.
So that $1 million, which is part of, as I look at it, is covering part of what we're using in reserves, is going to be repaid
Yep.
in 2 years.
Yep.
It'll be reimbursed in 2 years. Yes.
Yeah, and we kind of, we wouldn't have made the decision to do it if we felt that the big exposure on phase 2 of the Measure J work was going to happen before that. We don't think it is. We think that if feasibility is indicated, then the amount of time that would take to go to all the city councils and all the other chambers and talk to them about it is going to take up the end of the calendar year. Then you're into next year, and to do our work, to be in a position to even adopt a resolution would probably take 9 months to a year as well. So then the machinations around scheduling a bench trial and doing discovery and all of that would probably take another year. So we're at least 2 years away from any exposure, unknown exposure on that. But we took that into consideration when we looked at the reimbursement timeline on that project.
So I have a question. So at our board meeting on Monday, we're not going to go through this full presentation again, or what is the?
It's up to your chair to talk to her vice chair and make a decision, but
It'll be a public hearing item, so
yeah, I mean, we
Right.
should probably go through it quickly because there are folks who will not be here today, but that will be there then.
Okay.
But we did go through it at the last meeting, didn't we?
no,
No,
we did not.
we
We did not, oh, we
We
held
did
it
not.
off.
We're
doing
Okay,
it today.
all right, that's fine. Okay. Any other further discussion?
I have one other question, if I could. On page 32, the analysis of reserves, and you list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 categories of reserves. Are some of those reserves triggered by some ratio suggestion by the professionals or by the pension advisors or others, or are they estimates made locally?
Right, so pension and OPEB, that's just, we started with a placeholder. And, the problem with these unfunded liabilities is they don't come home to roost all at one time, and they don't come home to roost at the same level you predict today. We want to do some more analysis as to what that number should be. Should be 250,000 each, or what have you. So we're working on kind of a policy towards that. So there's no reference document that says this is a good number. Litigation insurance, based on the claims and the history of the district, we just know that that's an adequate number. But there always could be something that flies out of the blue. Capital equipment is based on Suresh's work, and you can see that that schedule. Drought and flood, I think we used to carry it at 300,000. I'm not sure how it got to 328,944. That's kind of an odd number, but
Well, no, because we were using some money for conservation purposes, and so basically that was that.
that's
offshoot
where it
was-
ended up. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so in the last year of the drought, we did the Save Water, Go Blue campaign, and we took that money from the reserve. So, yeah, there's no, the debt reserve, there is a specific ratio, and that is 1 year of maximum annual debt service, and so that's what that is. But there's not a whole lot of guidance out there on pension and OPEB. Some folks have tried to completely fund it with what's called a sidecar financing, and then that lump sum no longer matches the liability the next year because either the discount rate or the investment rate has changed. But we're working on that one.
Well, I just want to add the comment, and I'll second what Rudy Fisher said. I commend the district for having Suresh and the awards we've gotten in the past, multiple awards, and I think that's something we should remember.
So to that end, we were looking through the strategic planning documents from 2003, 2004, 2000, trying to just see where it was that some of these recommendations came from. And I think the oldest one we found was 2002, and in it, it said, get the GFOA certificate of excellence for financial reporting. And it took all the way until 2016 under Suresh's leadership to get there. So.
Fantastic. Okay, Director Hoffman?
Yeah, just one comment, and that is, I am concerned about the lack of identifying ASR and Sleepy Hollow as assets and identifying reserve funding to cover those. So again, it's common capital reserve identification for water utilities financially, and it's just a concern of mine that we're not addressing those at this point.
Any other comments? All right, well, on that, we'll adjourn, and we'll see you all Monday.
You know, you will see a capital reserve there next year.